What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today. Week 6 is about to get going here tonight. We got Texas State at Troy and Sam Houston at UTEP. A couple fun matchups. We actually have a pick on Sam Houston UTEP as well, which I'll be giving out at the end of the episode. We have a really intriguing weekend coming up, and I think we're going to find out a lot about certain teams, both tomorrow night on Friday as well as on Saturday, of course. So make sure to stick around to the end. Going to be giving out some picks for week 6. We're 22-10 on the year, so definitely make sure to catch those at the end of the episode. Week 6 is an interesting one because there's only one ranked versus ranked matchup, and even that one, number 9 Missouri at number 25 Texas A&M, is barely a ranked matchup because the Aggies are actually tied for 25th. So we were one singular AP poll point away from having 0 ranked versus ranked matchups this week. But despite that, this is a week where 2 top 10 teams are underdogs, including number 9 Missouri, which we'll get to in a second. Then there's also 6 other ranked teams who are on the road at quality unranked opponents. So this is a week that is filled with upset potential, and we'll be breaking down everything today. First up, the number 9 Missouri Tigers travel to College Station to take on the barely number 25 Texas A&M Aggies. Texas A&M is a 2.5-point favorite. The over-under is 48.5. Giving us an implied score of 26-23 A&M. This is already the second time in this young season that Texas A&M has been a 2.5-point favorite over a top 10 team at Kyle Field, with the first one ending in that 10-point loss to then number 7 Notre Dame. The Aggies are coming off a 21-17 victory over Arkansas in Dallas, and Missouri is coming off a bye week. The last 2 games for both teams have been decided by one possession. The last 2 times we saw Missouri before the bye week, they nearly lost to Boston College, but they were able to escape 27-21, and then they got taken into overtime by Vanderbilt, where they survived 30-27. And Texas A&M had the 4-point win over Arkansas and escaped a scare from Bowling Green 26-20 2 weeks ago. So neither team has looked particularly impressive lately, and they each have a major opportunity to earn a resume-building win on Saturday. The biggest keys to this game are if Missouri's secondary can force Texas A&M quarterback Marcel Reed into a couple mistakes, a few bad passes. I think they need at least 1 interception to win this game. If the Tigers pick off Reed twice, I think they'll have it. And the defenses that Reed has faced so far, since taking over for Connor Wigman, who played against Notre Dame in week 1, the defenses that Reed has faced are 92nd, 88th, and 46th. Missouri's defense is 8th, so Reed's going to have to play a very clean game, not turn it over, make a few big passes, and use his legs to put up some points on that Tiger defense. Another major thing is Missouri's rushing defense is 19th, allowing just 91.8 rushing yards per game. Texas A&M's rushing offense is 13th, putting up 231.6 rushing yards per game. So the ground game is going to be very important for Texas A&M to maintain possession, keep the ball away from Missouri, and keep this game within reach, like they did until late in the fourth quarter against Notre Dame. Nate Noel and Marcus Carroll are going to have to be big for Missouri. The Tigers have a very good running game themselves at 26th in the FBS. They're putting up just over 200 yards per game on the ground, and Texas A&M's rushing defense is 55th, giving up 124 yards per game on the ground. Every season, it feels like Texas A&M has one, if not multiple, of these massive games at home against a top 10 opponent, and that environment is always a major factor. I remember games like 2022 when they beat number 6 LSU, and 2021 when they beat number 1 Alabama on that last-second field goal, games like that. And I remember before the Notre Dame game in week 1 of this season, I compared that to when they had number 2 Clemson come to town back in 2018. That was Jimbo Fisher's first game against an FBS opponent as the Aggies head coach, and Notre Dame this year was Mike Elko's first game as the Aggies head coach. And going into that one, I said I thought the outcome would be pretty similar to that of the 2018 game, which was a close loss, which it ended up being. Also in that 2018 season, a few weeks after the loss at home to a top 10 opponent in Clemson, in week 6, the first week in October, they had a highly ranked SEC opponent come to College Station in number 13 Kentucky. And in 2024, a few weeks after a loss to top 10 Notre Dame, week 6, the first week in October, they have a highly ranked SEC opponent coming to College Station in number 9 Missouri. Despite being the lower ranked team both times, the Aggies were narrowly favored to beat Kentucky in 2018, and they're narrowly favored to beat Missouri this year. They ended up defeating number 13 Kentucky 20-14. Something I noticed the other day when I was watching highlights of the Texas A&M Arkansas game is that Marcel Reed kind of reminds me a little bit of Kellen Mond, just in terms of how they play. And 2018 was Kellen Mond's sophomore season, and he had 6 passing touchdowns in his first 3 starts. 2024 is Reed's sophomore season, and he has 6 passing touchdowns so far through 3 starts. To take the comparison between 2018 and 2024 a step further, they both also averaged 1.3 yards per carry against Arkansas the week before these respective games. In 2018, Kellen Mond and the Aggies beat Arkansas 24-17. Mond averaged 1.3 yards per carry. Last week, Marcel Reed and the Aggies beat Arkansas 21-17. Reed averaged 1.3 yards per carry. And now, that's not to say that 2024 will just be a copy or a repeat of 2018 for Texas A&M, but in a lot of ways it already has been, and as coincidental as it may be, I think the pattern of similarities between 2018 and 2024 might just continue. I'll roll with the Aggies to defeat number 9 Missouri at Kyle Field this Saturday. Number 10 Michigan goes on the road to unranked Washington, where the defending national champion Wolverines are 2.5-point underdogs, just like Missouri. The Huskies are 2.5-point favorites. The over-under is 41, giving us an implied score of 22-19 Washington. This game is a rematch of the 2023 season's national championship game, and of course the teams are very different this year. No J.J. McCarthy, no Blake Corum, no Mike Sainristil, no Michael Penix Jr., no Roma Dunze, no Jim Harbaugh, and no Kalen DeBoer. So obviously these teams have changed a lot, but still a very intriguing matchup. Michigan is number 10, and I've been pretty vocal about it on social media, but even with the win over USC, I'm really not convinced that the Wolverines are anywhere close to one of the 10 best teams in college football right now. They've done what they needed to do to win, except in the blowout loss to Texas at home, but found ways against USC, they found ways against Minnesota, even if it took having the Gophers' onside kick recovery taken away after a very questionable offside call, but and then they found a way to win after they were in a dogfight with Fresno State, who just lost by 45 to UNLV early in the season as well. Despite being 4-1 and ranked in the top 10, Michigan is 129th in college football in passing offense, averaging just 115 yards per game through the first month of the season. Washington's defense heading into week 6 is number 10 and is extremely balanced. The Huskies allow just 249 total yards per game, which is 121.8 on the ground and 127.2 through the air. Washington is 3-2 with losses to Washington State by 5 and on the road to Rutgers by 3. They missed 3 field goals last Friday against the Scarlet Knights, and they turned the ball over twice on downs in Rutgers territory. Very, very easily could have had that game. They were 1 yard short on 4th and goal from beating Washington State as well. They outgained Rutgers by 222 yards. 521 to 299 in total yardage. 521 to 299. They also outgained Washington State by 71 yards, and this is a 3-2 team that is 2 plays away from being 5-0. The key to this game will be Will Rogers' ability to navigate past Will Johnson and the Michigan secondary. Rogers has been phenomenal so far this year. His completion percentage is 74.8%. He's thrown for 1,354 yards, 10 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. Washington is one of just 6 teams that hasn't thrown an interception so far this season. One of just 6 out of 134. And among those 6, they have the most pass attempts. So coming into week 6, they are the safest team through the air with the ball. And if Michigan's going to win this game, Will Johnson needs to have a pick. Another interesting part about this matchup is that this is Michigan's first road game of the season. It is October, and the Wolverines are just now leaving Ann Arbor. 5 consecutive home games to start the year. Their first road trip is now to one of the loudest environments in the sport, against a team who probably wants some revenge for that loss in the title game last season. They're in the late TV window, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 Pacific, and they're an underdog, despite being in the top 10 and facing an unranked opponent. This game has trouble written all over it for Michigan. I think Washington will get back into the national picture a little bit after a very quiet first few weeks of the season, and I think the Huskies will beat the Wolverines on Saturday night. Another major game on Saturday is SMU on the road at number 22 Louisville. Louisville is a 7-point favorite. The over-under is 56.5, implied score of 32-25 Cardinals. Louisville looks to bounce back after that crushing loss to Notre Dame last week that was really right there for the taking, and they just couldn't get it done. And SMU looks to build off of their blowouts of TCU and Florida State over the past 2 weeks. I mentioned it in the recap episode for week 5, but SMU really looks like they're starting to kind of find their stride. They had a rocky start to the year. They lost to BYU, which at the time didn't really look like that good of a loss, or it just kind of looked like a bad loss. But now BYU's number 17, and they're 5-0. And they lost to the Cougars by 3 in what was a very winnable game. They were switching between quarterbacks for a while. They had both Preston Stone and Kevin Jennings playing for the first few weeks. But since they named Kevin Jennings QB1, they beat TCU by 24 and Florida State by 26. They seem to be kind of rounding into form, and they're playing like the team that most people probably thought they would be this season. These teams are currently 3rd and 4th, respectively, in chance to win the ACC. Louisville has a 17% chance, and SMU has an 11.3% chance, behind only Clemson and Miami. And winning this game will go a long way in increasing the likelihood of that happening for whoever comes out on top. And even though I believe SMU is significantly improved from where they were the first couple weeks of the season, and I think they're playing a lot better now, I also think Louisville is a very strong team. And I mentioned it in the recap episode, and I mentioned it a second ago, but that game against Notre Dame last week was one that Louisville really could have had. And I think they'll be a contender throughout the rest of the season for the ACC title and potentially an at-large college football playoff spot. So the Cardinals have also beaten 8 consecutive ACC opponents at home, and I think that streak continues this week with a victory over SMU. Another very interesting game this week is on Friday night when Syracuse travels to number 25 UNLV. The Rebels are ranked for the first time in program history. They're 4-0 for the first time in program history, and now they get a major challenge from Kyle McCord and the Syracuse Orange this week. UNLV is a 6.5-point favorite. The over-under is 58.5, implied score of 33-26 Rebels. This game is interesting for Syracuse because, like Michigan's trip to Washington, this is the Orange's first game away from home all year as well. They played every game at home in September, and now their first road trip of the season, it's not like it's to BC or Pitt or Louisville or something. It's to Las Vegas, of all places. So they basically have to travel all the way across the country, and this will be Fran Brown's first road game as Syracuse's head coach, so it'll be interesting to see how he navigates all that. But the Rebels are one of the best stories of the season so far. They've already beaten 2 Power 4 teams in Houston and Kansas. They dealt with all that NIL drama last week. They had their starting quarterback leave, and then they might have replaced him with someone who's even better. And all of that while basically having their best season in program history, being ranked for the first time ever, being 4-0 for the first time ever, and now they get a major test from Syracuse. Haj Malik Williams was electric in his first start for the Rebels last week. He was a king of the week in week 5 after he went 13 of 16 for 182 yards and 3 touchdowns, and then also had 12 carries for 119 yards and a touchdown as well. All of that in his first career start at UNLV. Their defense had 4 interceptions, their special teams had a blocked punt returned for a touchdown, and now they've got a huge stage in a primetime slot against another Power 4 opponent. This game could be really critical later in the year because if the Rebels are able to build off of this early momentum and be a contender for that Mountain West title and potentially win it, if they were to win this game, that could give them a non-conference edge over one of those other Group of 5 champions and really bolster their resume to be that highest ranked team in the Group of 5 and the Group of 5's representative in the college football playoff. For Syracuse, Kyle McCord currently leads the FBS in passing yards per game at 365. He's averaging 365 passing yards per game, and he's second in the FBS in passing touchdowns per game. McCord has 3 different games this season in which he's thrown for 4 touchdowns. 3 different games with 4 passing touchdowns is a Syracuse single-season program record. Single-season record. He's played 4 games. McCord's also thrown for over 300 yards in 4 consecutive games. That's the longest streak of 300-yard passing games in Syracuse history. Again, he's played 4 games as a member of the Syracuse Orange and owns 2 program records in as quick of a time as physically possible. I currently have him at number 5 in my Heisman list right now, behind Gene T, Ward, Milroe, and Travis Hunter. I think he's legit, and he and Syracuse have a big-time opportunity to build on this hot start to the season. Number 8, Miami crosses the country, literally the entire width of the United States of America, from Miami, Florida to Berkeley, California for a conference game on Saturday. The Canes will face Cal at 10:30 p.m. Eastern, 7:30 Pacific. This is also the site of College Gameday this week for the first time ever. A lot of people were surprised by this being the choice for College Gameday this week, but I think it's good to cross another school off of the 0 appearances list, and I think this could also be a very good game. The Canes are coming off that chaotic finish against Virginia Tech, and the Golden Bears had a bye week last Saturday, so they get a little bit extra time to prepare for this one. Miami is a 10-point favorite. Over-under is 54.5, implied score of 32-22 Canes. The main reason I could see this being a close game is that Cal leads the nation in interceptions. This is one of the most underrated defenses in the country, and as a whole, they have 10 interceptions, the most of any team, and Noel Williams by himself has 4, the most by any player. Cal dominated Auburn in Jordan-Hare, picking off Peyton Thorne 4 times in their victory over the Tigers. They beat Auburn by more than Oklahoma did last week. They allowed less points to Auburn than Oklahoma did. And Cal is in the top 25 in defensive efficiency, according to the ESPN FPI. So if they can force a pick out of Heisman contender Cam Ward, potentially a fumble, maybe a couple 3-and-outs, I could really see this being a tight game. Number 15, Clemson travels to Tallahassee to take on Florida State. The Tigers won't see former teammate DJ Uiagalelei. He actually suffered a broken finger on his throwing hand against SMU, so the Seminoles will be starting Brock Glenn. Glenn was the starter in last year's ACC Championship victory over Louisville, as well as the Orange Bowl against Georgia. Florida State lost 42-16 to SMU last week, and Clemson beat Stanford 40-14. The Tigers are 14.5-point favorites, and we'll see if they can win their 8th out of the last 9 against Florida State. All right, a couple quick ones to hit here. Number 12, Ole Miss travels to South Carolina. The Gamecocks are coming off a bye week, and the Rebels look to bounce back from that stunning loss to Kentucky last week. Ole Miss is a 9-point favorite. The over-under is 53.5. Implied score of 31-22 Rebels. After that crushing loss to LSU a few weeks ago, South Carolina now gets another opportunity against a highly ranked opponent to try to prove themselves as a legitimate player in the SEC this season. And Ole Miss will try to keep their college football playoff hopes alive on Saturday in Columbia. Undefeated Rutgers, yes, undefeated 4-0 Rutgers, travels to Nebraska this week. The Huskers are a 7-point favorite. The total is 41.5. Implied score of 24-17 Nebraska. Dylan Raiola and the Huskers had a bye week last week and got to regroup a little bit from that brutal overtime loss to Illinois. And Rutgers lucked out against Washington after the Huskies missed 3 field goals on Friday night. And I mentioned it earlier, but Rutgers was outgained by Washington by 222 yards in that game, but found a way to win. This is a very intriguing matchup between two programs who are really trying to prove their competence in the Big Ten and climb up the standings after solid starts to the year. Number 4, Tennessee travels to Fayetteville to take on Arkansas. The Hogs had a really tough loss to Texas A&M last week. That was a game that was certainly within reach, but one that slipped away. The Vols are a 13.5-point favorite. The over-under is 49.5. Implied score of 37-23 Tennessee. I kind of piled on Arkansas in the Week 5 recap episode, and I said basically that they just don't let themselves win big games, and it feels like they're consistently competitive in them, and it always feels like a pretty good game, but they just never finish ahead on the scoreboard. And this feels like a matchup where they could be in a tied game or a one-score game, and then have some devastating turnover or something to have Tennessee pull away. I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was close. This is Iamaleava's second true road game. I think Arkansas has a better offense than what the Vols faced against Oklahoma a couple weeks ago. And then even outside of Oklahoma, Tennessee's opponents have really not been good. NC State has not had a solid start to the year whatsoever. And then Kent State, worst team in the country. Chattanooga was their FCS team. So they get a legitimate challenge here on the road at Arkansas. And I think this will be a pretty tight game, but that Tennessee will end up pulling away late. Another highly ranked team on the road in a strange new conference matchup like Miami at Cal and Michigan at Washington is number 11 USC traveling to Minnesota this week. The Trojans are an 8-point favorite, so just about one possession. Over-under is 51, implied score of 29-21 USC. The Gophers gave Michigan all they could handle last week in the Big House. They ended up losing by 3, 27-24, but They also probably should have had another possession at the end of the game after they recovered an onside kick, but had it taken away from them due to an offside call. So they outgained Michigan by 55 yards. They had 5 more first downs than Michigan, and they were right in that game, and I think they could put up a similar fight against USC this weekend. Texas Tech at Arizona is a massive game in the Big 12. Arizona's coming off a huge win over number 10 Utah last week, and Texas Tech survived a 44-41 shootout with Cincinnati. And if you're new to the channel or to the Twitter or Instagram pages, I've kind of mentioned it here and there a few times, but I picked the Red Raiders to win the Big 12. And I still feel pretty confident in it, but this win would go a long way in bringing that closer to being possible. So big time game there for both Texas Tech and Arizona. And a couple other games to watch or keep an eye on. UCF travels to Florida, a fun in-state matchup. Really a must-win game for both teams, and one that'll kind of define the seasons for both the Knights and the Gators, and one that could define the tenure of Billy Napier at Florida. So very good matchup there. Then Boston College at Virginia, West Virginia at Oklahoma State, and Pitt at North Carolina. I think could all be very entertaining as well. All right, time for this week's picks. If you watched the Week 5 recap, I went through all of last week's picks. We were 4-4, unfortunately, the worst week of the season. But if breaking even is our worst week, then we're in a pretty good spot. And we had some really bad beats, too, that contributed to that. But 22-10 on the year, though, and I think we've got a couple good ones for Week 6. I also wanted to mention, like I do before this segment every week, that if you don't engage in any wagering on these games, just keep it that way. You're not missing out on much. There is far more losing than there is winning. There is some winning, and we've had the pleasure of doing so at 22-10 so far this year. But yeah, the stuff you'll see on Instagram or Twitter, the commercials that they put out, where they have like Post Malone putting 80 grand on a game, a lot of that stuff is just fake and designed to get people to try to start doing it. But yeah, if you don't feel comfortable with it, definitely don't start. And maybe if you find the premise entertaining and just want to hear about it, feel free to stick around for a few minutes. But if you don't want to hear about it at all, feel free to check out now. First up, we have UConn minus 5.5 in the first quarter over Temple. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I had UConn's line last week. They cleared it by 38 points. They were a 5.5 point favorite over Buffalo and won 47-3. I had their line 2 weeks ago. They were a 2.5 point favorite over FAU. They won 48-14. The Huskies have been rolling lately. I like the minus 5.5 in the first quarter specifically, and I think they'll get out to a hot start. I also have the over 34.5 between UConn and Temple as well. Temple gave up 51 to Oklahoma's offense, which we've seen now is not all that great. And they gave up 42 to Army, who is pretty good, but that's still a lot of points. UConn scored 47 and 44 in their last two, and I think combined we can get over that 34.5 mark. We're getting down into the weeds a little bit here on this one, but this caught my eye. I've got Marshall's first quarter race to 6 against App State. So basically what that means is that we need Marshall to score a touchdown in the first quarter before App State does. The reason that I like this is because App State has had quite the pattern so far this year in first quarters against the 3 FBS opponents that they've played so far. At the end of the first quarter against Clemson, they trailed 35-0. At the end of the first quarter against East Carolina, they trailed 16-0, and at the end of the first quarter against South Alabama, they trailed 14-0. So not only has App State not scored any touchdowns in any first quarter against an FBS opponent this season, they've given up at least 2 touchdowns in all of those games in the first quarter. And not only that, for Marshall as well, they've scored the first touchdown in the first quarter in 3 of their 4 games so far, including scoring first on the road in Columbus on Ohio State. They led the number 3 Buckeyes 7-0. So Marshall first quarter race to 6 over App State. I also have Sam Houston at UTEP under 50 points. That game is tonight if you're watching on Thursday. Last week we were right on the money with Sam Houston and Texas State's over. We had over 55.5. That game finaled at 79. But I think the under is the play for this one tonight. And lastly, Virginia Tech at Stanford under 50.5. Another one of these strange new conference games, but Stanford's defense is one of the most underrated in college football so far this season, in my opinion. Real quick, ask yourself what your current perception of Stanford's defense is, if you even have one at all. Okay, now that you have that picture, whatever you think of Stanford's defense, they have the 8th best rushing defense in the FBS. 8th of 134 teams. They have allowed 1 rushing touchdown to a running back this season. 4 rushing touchdowns total. 1 to a running back, 3 to quarterbacks. And that's against TCU, Syracuse, and Clemson. So they've had a very difficult schedule so far, and they also had to cross the country back-to-back weeks to Syracuse and Clemson. And now they get a home game after those 2 trips. Virginia Tech has to go all the way out there to them, and I think this will be a relatively low-scoring game. That's going to wrap up this episode of the show. I really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. Week 6 has a sneaky good slate. It's another one of these weeks where there's just one ranked versus ranked matchup. A lot of people are calling it dull or boring. College game day is going to a place they've never been. They're going to Cal when they could have been at Texas A&M or whatever people are saying. But I think this will end up being a very eventful weekend. So make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, and follow if you're listening on Spotify. And make sure to follow at CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.